Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. And we have a very, very timely show for you today. We have as our guest today U.S. Ambassador Chaz Freeman, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and a whole bunch of other titles and attributes in the State Department and the Defense Department. There's very few that have been as tenured and as experienced in the United States today as Chaz Freeman. Welcome back to the show, Ambassador.
Glad to be here. Nice to see you, Danny.
Good to see you too. And man, we have a lot to talk about today. We're gonna jump into the situation with the Israeli-Hamas war in the Middle East, and that just unfortunately seems to be changing and growing and expanding by the day. And in fact, we had in just a couple of days ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that he's going to actually be expanding the war, which is a pretty eye-opening statement given the level of destruction and huge level of bombardment that's been going on for up to this point since October 7th. It's hard to imagine it getting more, but let's get a bit of a running start into this to see how does this square with what the United States is saying, what they want, and where might this be going in terms of the actual combat within the Gaza Strip, and where might it go diplomatically in the region. So first of all, let's start off with our National Security Advisor, Sullivan, who kind of laid out a few days back or a week or so ago kind of what the U.S. expectations are.
I have and will continue to state President Biden and the United States' commitment to preserving space for peace, for a two-state solution where Israel's security is guaranteed.
So there he's saying, which Biden has said many times, our ultimate strategic objective is a two-state solution to bring peace, which sort of matches with what Netanyahu claims on paper, that peace is the ultimate objective. But then when you start getting into the nuts and bolts of, okay, but how are we going to get there? And what are the rules of engagement? What is the limits that we can go to? And especially because some of these things that Israel is doing, actually a lot of them are very controversial and are raising anger across the globe almost every quarter. And to address that, Sullivan also said, well, here's some of our expectations.
We're not here to tell anybody, you must do X, you must do Y. We're here to say, this is our perspective as your partner, as your friend. This is what we believe is the best way to achieve both your tactical and strategic goals. There will be a transition to another phase of this war, one that is focused in more precise ways on targeting the leadership and intelligence-driven operations. I'm not going to speak to timelines, and I'm not going to speak to conditions here from the podium. What I am going to say is that we had a very constructive conversation yesterday about the transition from the high-intensity phase forward, and we expect that will occur. When exactly that happens and under exactly what conditions will be a continuing intensive discussion between the United States and Israel.
Now, one of the things that really stood out to me about that conversation, or about his comments there, were that we're going to have a constructive conversation and we're telling them what we would like, almost like we're a junior partner in this. And, to this point to where they may go, yeah, noted kind of thing. And in fact, to underscore that, we also had a week or so ago, John Kirby say what we're not going to do.
We are not dictating rules of engagement on the battlefield to another military. We would have no right to do that. I can't speak to the ROE. Heck, I don't even talk about American ROE. I certainly can't speak to Israeli rules of engagement. That's really for them to speak to. They have taken seriously, and they've been receptive to the messages about being careful and cautious, and they have taken steps to try to be more targeted, more precise. And part of those steps, Martha, is using ground forces and not just relying on airstrikes.
So it sounds like that, again, this whole junior partner kind of deal. Now, we're not going to tell them anything because they're not going to listen to us anyway. That's kind of the gist that comes out to me. Now, this is all in the context that, like I said a minute ago, it's eyebrow raising that Netanyahu says that he's going to expand the war, because I believe about 10 days ago, this is what he said was his baseline.
שום דבר לא יעצור אותנו. אנחנו הולכים עד הסוף, עד הניצחון. לא פחות מזה. אולי לנו יום קשה מאוד, וכל יום יש לנו בנים יקרים שנופלים. ועם זאת אני רוצה להגיד בצורה הברורה ביותר, מה שאמרתי עכשיו, כמפקד בשטח. אנחנו ממשיכים עד הסוף. אין בכלל שאלה כזאת. ואני אומר את זה גם נוכח הכאב הגדול, אבל גם מול הלחצים הבינלאומיים. שום דבר לא יעצור אותנו. אנחנו הולכים עד הסוף, עד הניצחון. לא פחות מזה.
Now, Mr. Ambassador, I've read over the weekend that some of the pressure for Netanyahu to claim he's going to expand this might be to say, hey, I need to get this done quicker, because even domestically, apparently from two separate quarters, he's getting lots of pressure. One from the family members of those hostages who say, hey, do whatever it takes to get our hostages back, and don't just keep blowing up tunnels or whatever, flooding them, et cetera. And then another group that's saying, look, you have started to back off a little bit of your wanton destruction. And so the troop casualties have been going up, and they're angry about that, because apparently they have been listening at least a little bit to the junior partner and have been changing some things, but they want him to go back harder. So if he loses either that quarter or another quarter, or even the quarter within Israel that's saying, this is now a destructive war, and it's not going to be successful, and it's killing too many people, it seems like he might be saying, okay, I better put the pedal to the metal now while I still can, because otherwise something may force me to stop later. How do you see this thing unfolding?
Well, the United States has given Mr. Netanyahu a blank check. That's what Jake Sullivan's statement meant. It will not have been well received internationally. It will be seen as gross hypocrisy. The world understands that all the talk about focusing on the leadership of Hamas and taking out Hamas is verbal cover for genocide. It is a distraction from the real objective. And that is becoming more and more clear. There's quite a campaign going on now about what the Israelis call transfer, which means expelling all the Palestinians from Gaza. There are articles appearing saying, well, they should live in Sinai. The former Israeli ambassador to the UN is saying, no, countries around the world should take them in. This is humanitarian. This is the only humanitarian solution. Nobody is saying what they ought to say, which is the best solution would be to remove the damn settlers from the West Bank and return them to either Israel or wherever they originally came from. What right do the Israelis have to tell Palestinians or the world that there should be no Palestinians left in Gaza? I think we're dancing around the main issue here, which is that the minute the United States stops protecting Israel in international circles, the UN and other places, and stops the flow of weapons to Israel, this war ends. And when it ends, there has to be consideration of the two-state solution. But
that gets us to a really sticky. That gets us to a really sticky situation. Let's see, from the Netanyahu government, for the Israeli government situation, let's say that the pressure does become so great internationally, and that for whatever reason, Biden has a change of heart, and he says, all right, this has gone too far. You've killed too many people. I'm not going to be supportive of this. I'm not going to put my name on this any further. We're going to cut off all of this stuff, and you either change something or you're on your own. And he says, okay, well, we can't continue on without the support or the military support. What could Israel do? Because the government do? Because I'm sure that people would say, wait, you didn't finish the job. Hamas still exists. They're still there. How would they handle that really tough nut to crack there?
Well,
they stop the war now.
I'm sorry to say that whatever happens, Hamas or something very similar to it will exist when the fighting is over, and whether it exists in Gaza or it exists on the West Bank or it exists in the Palestinian diaspora, it is a resistance to Israeli occupation, expulsion, oppression, denial of the human rights of the Palestinian people, and it's not going to go away. And furthermore, I think it's fair to say that all of the horror and sympathy that attached to Israel on October 7th has been undone by Israel's grotesque, disproportionate massacres and other policies in Gaza. You see Israeli real estate companies now advertising that when the war is over, they will build you a beachfront villa in Gaza.
Have they? I've not seen that.
This is clear. It's very clear what the objective is. It is to depopulate Gaza. And when Mr. Netanyahu says they'll keep going until victory, that's what he means. Now, the question is, Mr. Biden, who is running a campaign for president and is dependent on campaign donations from plutocrats who support Israel, very dependent on them. How is he going to balance this? Does he have a conscience? He's a Catholic. Does he follow the Pope's demands for humanitarian ceasefire?
Yeah.
Not just a short one, but a long one. Does he care about the need for a settlement of that involves some kind of Palestinian self-determination? Or is he only wedded to those donors and the Zionism that they support?
Well, now let me ask you this, especially in that regard there, because there was a UN resolution, a UNSC resolution that was passed a few days back that had multiple times been delayed because of wording that the United States was presumably trying to find some wording that they could actually support so they wouldn't veto it. But in the final analysis, there was one specific phrase that's getting a lot of traction. I wonder if you could kind of unpack for us what the real meaning might this be and what the intent is from Washington based on the inclusion of this phrase, which it says that it wants to, quote, create conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. Now, on the surface of it, to a novice, it sounds like, okay, well, that's great. We want the war to end. But from what I understand, diplomatically, is that's actually a code word that could be interpreted by Israel to do even more military. Could you explain that?
I think it is interpreted by Israel as a green light to do whatever it takes, to coin a phrase, to finish off the Palestinians, which has been Israel's objective since its establishment in 1948. You hear very open statements by members of the Israeli cabinet, as well as ordinary Israelis, calling for the extermination, annihilation, expulsion of the entire Palestinian population, including that on the West Bank, not just Gaza.
So how does that phrase contribute to that?
Well, because it says nothing. It basically is a meaningless phrase. It reminds me, it is a statement of principle, and it reminds me of Napoleon's observation that he prefers statements of principle because they don't imply anything will actually get done. They're empty. This was the product of a long American effort over at least 3 days to gut a resolution that would have called for a ceasefire in Gaza. It did not call for a ceasefire. Instead, it left a lot of ambiguity, which, as I indicated, Israel interprets as a green light to, quote, finish the jobs, as Mr. Netanyahu told his troops on December 15th in the clip that you showed.
Yeah. So I believe it was either yesterday or the day before yesterday in the New York Times, there was a piece by the mayor of Gaza. And in that, he basically said that this is not all these bombardments that you're seeing on the screen right now, for example, are not Israel going after Hamas to take out military targets, but that they are expressly targeting physical infrastructure, schools, mosques, power stations, water treatment facilities, all the things that are necessary to sustain civil life after the war was over, that they're methodically taking these things out in order to make it impossible for the Palestinians to stay there whenever there's an end of war negotiated settlement of any kind. Is he telling the truth, or is he just saying, oh, I'm just looking at it from a negative perspective from my side to make Israel look bad? How do you see it?
Well, I think you should add hospitals in that list. Essentially, the Israelis are making Gaza unlivable. Unlivable. All of the infrastructure, both physical and human, required to sustain life is being destroyed. For 2 months, Israel has been trying to starve the Palestinians. 80% of Palestinians are now starving. Israel's hope is that they will break through somehow into the Sinai. Egypt is moving tanks and more troops to the border to prevent that. The last thing on earth that Egypt wants is a group of angry, destitute Palestinians who support the Muslim Brotherhood. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is the president for life of Egypt, apparently, has been focused on destroying the Muslim Brotherhood, a democratic Islamist movement, with a rather incompetent one, apparently, in Egypt. And there's no way they're going to accept Palestinians. 2 million surviving Palestinians after the genocide in the Sinai. Sinai is already a lawless area full of smugglers and resistance to the Egyptian government. So this is not going to happen.
Now,
So
what do
the
you
world,
think about that?
basically confronts a situation in which we have to make a choice. Do we let Israel get away with starvation of the Palestinians, murder of the Palestinians, genocide of the Palestinians, or will we do what we can do, stop the weapons supplies, stop the political protection, and end this war?
Now, what is there a red line might not be the right phrase to use here, but is there a limit? I'll also put it that way to two separate categories of people in the region. One is Arab regimes throughout the region. The second is the Arab populations throughout the region. Is there a limit to how far Israel can go towards this, and whether it's intentional or just de facto? That is what's going on. Those images we shown aren't manufactured. That is for sure what's actually happening on the ground, no matter what anybody wants to feel or think or believe about it. That's the reality on the ground. Is there a limit to how far Israel can keep going? Because it's bad so far, but the number is only about 22,000 people killed. If it turns into like 40, 50, 60, 100,000 died, whether it's of starvation, disease, or bombs, is there a limit to where those actors in the region finally say enough is enough and they're going to do something about it? Is that even possible?
I think there is a limit, but I don't know where it is. Most Arab governments are autocracies, and they're relatively immune to public opinion. However, the most recent poll in Saudi Arabia shows that 96% of Saudis believe that all Arab countries should break diplomatic relations with Israel. There should be no cooperation with Israel. Saudis who have been fighting a war with the Houthis in Yemen are supportive of the Houthi effort to halt shipping to Israel in the Red Sea. There are Arab democracies. Jordan is a constitutional monarchy with a democracy, a very large population composed of Palestinians, about 60%. Jordan has broken off relations essentially with Israel. And there is a real danger as time goes on that Arab populations will act to overthrow governments that do not reflect their anger and their distress at the mass murder of fellow Arabs in Gaza. And what's happening in the West Bank, which is 370 settler attacks, murders of Palestinians. Yes, there is a limit, but we don't know where it is. So I would say there's another element here, Danny, and that is Lebanon is a failed democracy, but it is a democracy. And Hezbollah has been very cautious in its approach to Israel. It has held back its punches at northern Israel. Israel and Hezbollah have been exchanging artillery fire and missiles. About 100 Lebanese have been killed by these, a lesser number of Israelis, but 100,000 Israelis have been displaced from northern Israel by this. Hezbollah has been content so far to try to tie down Israeli forces and make symbolic punishment of Israel an objective. But several things could trigger Hezbollah into action. One of them is an American attack on Yemen in response to the Yemeni attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. That might well bring either Iran itself into the war or Hezbollah. The Houthis and Hezbollah have a pretty good relationship. And I think that Hezbollah is embarrassed by the fact that it's Yemen that is the only Arab government that is taking forceful action to punish Israel for its gross violations of international human rights law.
I believe I saw a Yemenese government spokesman maybe 3 days ago, say that if the United States attacks targets in Yemen, that they would then basically call open warfare against the United States. And they specified we're not against the American people at all, but we're against the American government if it attacks us. Do you think that's just blather, or do you think they would actually make good on that?
No, I think they would make good on it. And I think the last several years show that the Houthis are quite resourceful and very good warriors. They are a serious force. In the fact that Yemen, which is one of the most backward, deprived, poor countries in the world, is producing drones and rockets and that pose a menace not just to shipping but to Israel, demonstrates that they have the capability to do grave damage to that flotilla out there. And it's not an exchange that we should welcome. So for a $2,000 drone, we fire a $1 million missile.
Yeah.
This is not sustainable. We also, by the way, have reconfigured the Navy, our Navy, so that it no longer has forward deployed supply ships. Basically, our ships will run out of ammunition, and then they'll have to run to a port to replenish. And I don't think, it's interesting. The other Red Sea countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Sudan, of course, Eritrea, none of them have come in on our side in this effort to restore freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, which is very important to them. I mean, Egypt is the custodian and manager of the Suez Canal, and you can't get there except through the Red Sea.
That's a big problem. But speaking of ammunition, there was a report out in The Guardian today, I believe, that says that there have been, for a long time, some secret weapons caches that the U.S. has stored in Israel, presumably because it's a safe place, and should we ever need it in the region, it was in a secure location that we could have ready access to it if there was any problems elsewhere. But now there's apparently some reports that it's actually being diverted to Israel itself, which would seem to say it's depleting further our own stocks should they ever be needed. Do you have any knowledge about those reports?
This was a corrupt bargain with Israel many decades ago. It basically, the problem was at that time somewhat changed now, but not completely, probably not changed after the war in Gaza. The problem was that weapons stored in Israel could not be transported to any other country in the region because they all had boycotts and embargoes and blockades of Israel. So we put weapons in Israel with the explicit condition that Israel would have access to them. So theoretically, they were forward pre-deployed American munitions. In fact, they were pre-deployed aid to Israel. And that is undoubtedly what is now happening. Israel's drawing on those pre-positioned munitions for its own benefit. Another aspect of our complete complicity in what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank.
Now, you spoke a moment ago about the issue with Egypt and why they would not want Palestinians to come in because they have great antipathy to the Muslim Brotherhood. But then you have in the other quarter of the region there, Turkey, who has a very good relationship with both the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. Similar question to them. Is there a line which could be crossed if Israel continues to go on where some of this heated rhetoric that Erdogan has been saying almost from the beginning, that he could also make good on that? Is that also even a possibility, or is that truly just him just trying to make a lot of noise, but he would never actually do anything because it would cost him in other areas, whether with NATO or economics or otherwise?
Well, Turkey, although it is Mr. Erdogan is quite autocratic, Turkey is a democracy and it responds to public opinion, and public opinion in Turkey is being inflamed by what they're observing in Gaza. So there is a break point there at some point. I think Mr. Erdogan is basically posturing for benefit of his own public opinion, and also because, frankly, the statements he makes resonate with Arab populations and build Turkish influence in the region. At what point he might decide that he actually has to do something, I don't know. But one of the more interesting things that's happened is this has pushed Iran and Turkey together. So you can't assume that one of them will remain neutral while the other acts. And I could see if the Turkish relationship with NATO, which is very attenuated, the relationship with us is very bad, is much of a constraint on Turkish action. I'm not convinced.
Yeah. So, what do you think is the long term implications of this for, I guess, regional balance of power? I know a lot of people would like this just get this over with. Let's get Hamas defeated so we can get back to life the way it was before. So it doesn't sound to me like that's even going to be possible, because either Israel is going to remain unimpeded and somehow actually get rid of all the people, where they would put 2 million people, or maybe even 3 million or 5 million if you want to add in the West Bank. I don't know where they would physically go, or they're going to have to be forced by us, by withholding stuff, to come to some kind of an accommodation. But in either way, I don't think things ever go back to the way they were. So based on your knowledge of the region, I wonder if you could just make even the broadest brushstroke expectation of what could be the consequence of all this if Israel is, number one, is left unimpeded and they somehow succeed in getting this out. What does that do for the region, for the U.S. interest in the region? And what if we finally say enough is enough and we stop them from these processes, and then they have to make good on some kind of a two-state solution? What does that do to the region?
Well, that's a hell of a complicated question, Danny. First, Israel's lost the moral argument, not just in the region, but globally. The Holocaust, which gave it immunity to criticism, and which gave force to its profligate charges of anti-Semitism against anybody who criticized it, has evaporated. It is now conducting its own Holocaust. When people look at Israel, they won't see the victims of the Holocaust in Europe. Sorry, they will see the perpetrators of a Holocaust in the Middle East. In the region, those countries that had normalized with Israel, like Bahrain, are reversing course. The UAE remains in the Abraham Accords, but it's a matter of time until it's forced to withdraw. The possibility of Saudi normalization with Israel is off the table.
Yeah.
That is the region.
And I'm sorry, while we're sitting there talking about that topic, and I wonder if you could also, tell us a little bit about what these attacks against the Iranian minister in Syria the other day. Do you know anything about what the purpose of that was, and then what's the implication of that as well?
Well, I think the Israelis are back to their old tricks of trying to use disproportionate violence to deter presumed enemies. Unfortunately, I think in the case of Iran, this just increases the danger of war, doesn't reduce it, and it's foolish. And it's like allegedly Mr. Netanyahu wanted, after October 7th, to attack Lebanon to, quote, take out Hezbollah. And he was dissuaded from that by us, apparently. This is a man who's at the end of his political career and rather desperate and not thinking clearly about the security of his own country. He's more concerned about saving his own hide from criminal charges of corruption. Let me go back because I had a coughing fit. Let me go back and say that the reaction among Arab populations will constrain anything that Arab countries seek to do with Israel in the future. But sadly, this is not limited to Israel, because everybody understands that it is the United States that is the full partner of Israel, having given Israel a blank check to resupply itself from our troves of munitions, our weapons, and that we're doing that. And everybody has observed the way in which we have gutted international calls for a ceasefire. One of the victims of this war in the long run is likely to be the United Nations, which has been shown to be completely feckless. And I think there are people around the world now looking at the United Nations and saying, well, the League of Nations was abolished and replaced by the United Nations. It's probably time to replace the United Nations with something else. and something that isn't in New York, which was the location chosen after World War II because people were concerned about the possibility of a return of American isolationism, and also because we were the primary victor in the war. So I think the long-term effects of this are not just regional, they're global. And this is a disaster for the prestige of the United States on several levels. First, morally, because there's no way to defend what Israel is doing. It is, everybody understands that the focus on Hamas is just a cover for a broader genocide, and we're complicit in it. And it's not consistent with realistic foreign policy because it's clearly damaging to our interests, both in the short and long term, and yet we persist. We have placed our domestic political interests ahead of our interests as a country. And this is apparent to everyone. So the next time an American goes out and talks about democracy, human rights, humanitarian law, the so-called rules-based order, we will be laughed out of court. Nobody will take us seriously. So this is this is a real turning point in history, not just in the region, but globally, I think.
Do you think that there's any chance that, I think that you do see more and more people in the United States, and I'm talking about just regular population, already saying, hey, they see these images like what we're showing on the TV now daily, and they think, man, everybody, at least initially, understood that, October 7th and the terrorist attack and this horrible things that were done to a lot of Israeli civilians. A lot of people were just reflexively, oh yeah, 9/11, we've been there, done that. So yeah, we get why you'd want to go after the guys who did this. And I think a lot of even those people are going, yeah, but this is way beyond that. And how do you even know who did it? Because you're just killing everybody on the ground in the battle zones. There doesn't seem to be any distinction. You had Kirby saying, we're not going to tell you about rules of engagement. And that's the only way you can know how you're going after the people who did that or not. And it seems like people are going to start being even more against that and recognizing what you just said, that this is actually working against American national interest in the region. But do you see any prospect that politically, whether it's the administration or the people who are running to want to be the next administration, would recognize the harm to Americans and say, hey, we're going to change things up here. We're not going down that path because that's harmful for us. You have to make some changes or you are going to be on your own. Is there any chance that we have a leader that would do that?
I'm the wrong person to ask that question, Danny. I can't estimate where our broken politics are going to take us. We face the prospect of two presidential candidates who are enormously divisive, each of them loathed by a very large part of the population, no communication. Mr. Biden, who's the incumbent, has lost greatly in the polls. This is the first time anyone can remember a foreign policy issue causing such a precipitous drop in popularity. He's lost the youth vote, the vote of people of color. I thought it was enormously significant the other day. New Birth mega church, an African-American mega church in Atlanta.
Right, yes.
Celebrated with the Palestinians and demanded a ceasefire. This is becoming an issue for voting blocs in the United States, not just American Muslims, but African Americans and others who are crucial to Mr. Biden. And I think he is guaranteeing his defeat in the polls, which means we'll have probably Mr. Trump as president again. And that's not good news for the world either. So, and American interests. So this is an imponderable. But, I think the real issue here is the evolution of opinion in the United States and abroad is all in the same direction. It is toward antipathy to Israel, opposition. Israel is going to emerge from this war a pariah state, and with much limited support in America, in the United States population. And I suspect other countries will follow those who, like Malaysia, Bolivia, and so on, who are taking action to punish Israel for what it's doing. These are heartbreaking images, by the way.
Yeah, they are. And you know, and I want to address something that one of our viewers there just put up on there, because I hear this a lot where, you know, because we're talking about what Israel's doing and, you know, and some of these, you know, whether it's genocide or you know, destroying hospitals, et cetera. And then the people are saying, yeah, but you're not talking about Hamas because they've done a lot of bad things too. And I wonder if you could just touch on that, because I have personally had no hesitation calling out the, you know, the murder that a lot of them did, you know, especially on 10/7 and some other stuff. And while we can say the Palestinian people have been, you know, suppressed for decades and all that led to a lot of the conditions, but still the things that they did were in fact wrong. But then I think you get to the issue of proportionality. I just wonder how you see that dynamic.
Yeah, I think what Hamas did on October 7th, or more accurately, what Hamas and other Palestinians who accompanied it in the breakout from the Gaza concentration camp did, since it's not clear that Hamas itself was aimed at anything other than military facilities and capturing members of the IDF and the reserves. But a lot of other people did come out of Gaza with them, and I think that what they did was absolutely criminal and inexcusable. On the other hand, I think the appropriate analogy here is a slave revolt. Nat Turner, 1831, led a slave revolt in Southern Virginia, and the objective of these enslaved African Americans who'd been brutally mistreated was to kill every white person they saw. And they killed about 60 white people, including women and children. And that was clearly criminal. But then you have to ask yourself, was the oppression, the violence against them by the slave owners equal to their action? Or was there a moral difference between those who react to enslavement, oppression, persecution, and violence with their own violence? Are these the same? I don't think anybody would say they're the same, even before you get to killing 21,000 Palestinians or more, because many are buried under the rubble.
Right.
No, I mean, of course, it's easy to understand the desire for revenge that Israelis felt, and to link that to our feelings on 9/11. That's true. I think the administration, one thing the administration has said that strikes me as very sensible on this is, don't follow our example on 9/11. We went berserk. We ended up doing huge damage to ourselves and to many other people who are quite innocent. I mean, you served in Afghanistan. You know about it.
I do. And, you know, and I actually think one of the interesting analogies that's not been made that I think is very applicable is what Israel is doing right now in going way overboard and heavy handed would be equivalent of if in October of 2001, when we went to Afghanistan and especially into Kabul, where at that time, you know, you had the Al-Qaeda members who were being harbored by the members of the Taliban government. If we just said, yeah, we're going to go in and just literally wipe out Kabul and we're going to kill everybody, instead of just going after the specific people that we were going after, whether it was bin Laden or some of his particular operatives. I mean, even at that, we had some restraint, that we didn't just, you know, kill all of the Afghan people who were, you know, part of the Taliban for that matter. We didn't just kill everyone. But right now, Israel is going over the top and just really making no distinction in the combat zone. I think that's the reason why you had those Israeli hostages were killed by the IDF troops, because their rules of engagement allowed them to kill any man in the combat zone. Otherwise, they would never have shot somebody who had no shirt on and a white flag. So there has to be
the rules of engagement clearly are kill everything that moves. And that's, you know, I think the analogy to Afghanistan needs expansion. The only force that ever succeeded in pacifying Afghanistan was that of Genghis Khan. And he did it with genocide. And that's the Israeli approach. Well, we went through World War II, and there were horrors committed, many of them against Jews, against European liberals, against German liberals, against Poles, against gypsies, against people by the Nazis. And the Japanese were terribly cruel to the populations that they invaded and conquered. And so after World War II, we drew up a whole range of international laws, the Geneva Conventions, which prohibited exactly what Israel is now doing. Now, usually when cases of genocide arise, for example, at the Nuremberg trials, you have to prove intent to commit genocide. The Nazis were sufficiently shamed by what they were doing that they tried to conceal it. But the Israelis are out in the open expressing intent to annihilate every Palestinian or expel every Palestinian, whichever works. So there's no problem of proving intent to commit genocide. And the physical evidence of genocide is there, along with the physical evidence of the flattening of Gaza. Sometimes,
that's the biggest problem.
I think the issue you started off here, I was reminded of the observation of William Tecumseh Sherman, the great Union general in our Civil War, who said, the purpose of war is to produce a better peace. This is not going to produce a better peace for Israel. And that is, or for the United States.
Yeah.
It should concern us.
It should very much. And I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. I actually have another TV show to get to. I just realized I'm late for. So
you should do it.
Thank you very much for coming on today. This is unfortunately continue on.
Okay.
But thank you for coming on, and we will have you back very soon because this is going to continue on for a long time.
I'm sorry to say you're right. Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. And we will see you next time on Deep Dive.
All right.